Good day to you all and welcome to the 7th edition of Psych-IT. I'm Thijs Pepping, your host of today, and today will be all about play, games and esports. And of course, we focus on the technology side and the psychology side and aspects of these plays, games and esports, because that's what we do here at Psych-IT. We explore new emerging technologies from the psychology side. Our first meetup was already in 2019, and then we talked about sleeping technology. We had sessions about love and technology like Tinder, but also robotica, mediated touch. Can you hug somebody with technology and what does it do in your psyche? And we used to have these events in a physical room, but now due to Corona, we do it like this, via YouTube. We have held sessions about healthcare and the youth, and the last one was about deepfake therapy, in which we had a pioneer talking about how you could use deepfakes to say goodbye to your loved ones who have already passed away, for example. But today, it's all about esports games and plays. We have René Glas from the University of Utrecht. We have Adam Lobel, who works at Blizzard in the US. And we have Jussi Moorman, who is a pioneer in managing and coaching an esports team. We have three people who will be interviewing these experts, but we have also you guys, because we are a community and we want to have your questions incorporated into these interviews. And you can ask your questions through the chat. We've also set up some Mentimeter questions to get your input. So let's start with that maybe. If you would be so kind to grab your phone or your second device and go to menti.com and put in the code below, or just scan the QR code. Then we will get your input. Let me have a try myself. So the first question is, we have an interesting community with people who work in psychology and we have people who work in technology, and it's interesting to know which ages are coming to which meetups. And it's now all about games. So do we only have young? Let me unmute myself. So we have a lot of youngsters in the public. Nobody is older than 50 years old. That's already kind of interesting. Because games, it's nothing new. We have had them for a couple of decennia. But the reason why we are seeing this as an emerging technology is partly because Generation C and the millennials are coming into the workforce. So now you have serious people with serious jobs still playing their games at home. You are seeing numbers in every direction growing. So the average age is going up, but also the number of viewers who are watching esports or streams. The prizes are rising that you can win. The number of playing, the hours people are playing, you name it. So there are things changing, and that's why we want to dive into the subject today. Let me ask you another question. Like, you are watching this, do you feel yourself a gamer, or are you interested because you are viewing your children game every day and you want to know more about it? What's your motivation to watch? Maybe we can dive into that later. Okay, a lot of gamers still going on. But let me remove this one. Keep them coming, all your answers. We will incorporate them into the interviews. But without further ado, I want to introduce you, René Glas and Ding Ding. I will go to the backstage. Keep your questions coming into the chat, and I will direct them to Ding Ding and René. It's up to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Thijs. So good evening, everyone. We'll start off the evening with René Glas, who is an assistant professor at Utrecht University. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, René?
Sure. I teach and do research, write about new media and digital culture, and specifically games and everything related to play and game culture at Utrecht University. I'm a coordinator of the master's program in new media there as well. My research on games, and also one of the reasons I was invited here, has mostly to do with aspects like game-related literacy. What does it mean to truly understand, have a critical understanding of what games and play are? So not just computer games, entertainment games, but also forms of gamification or other like playful media forms, which might be games, but not all of them are games. I did a whole bunch of research on World of Warcraft for my PhD back then, a well-known Blizzard game. One of the speakers works there, of course. And today we're going to be talking about another phenomenon, which is a key part of what we do at Utrecht University, which is an interest in what we call a ludification of culture, where we see the culture, society being increasingly ludified, being made more playful when it comes to media technologies that we use and the way we behave on those media technologies, far beyond the rise of computer gaming, which was mentioned just before. And of course, as part of that ludification of culture, we have seen an increase of the use of games and play and playful design, gameful design in non-entertainment areas. So serious games, you just saw a small slide of that already with some examples of applications of games and play beyond mere entertainment.
Yes, thank you for that introduction. Now, before we start off with the rest of the talk, we have another question in the Mentimeter. Here, we want to ask you, what's your favorite game? If everyone can grab the phone and fill in an answer, that would be very interesting to see.
Oh, we are allowed to type in 3, I see.
Yes. So you can also fill in multiple answers. What's your favorite game, René?
I just typed in Half-Life 2 for various reasons.
Oh, nice. Online Catan. Yes, definitely in this age. That's very nice. Magic the Gathering, very popular when I was still a student. Can remember that. I see we have a very diverse audience with all the games that they're writing down. Very nice to see. The word cloud is now too small for me to read it anymore, but it looks very nice. Really a lot of different games, different gamers that we have here. Can we go on to the next question, Thijs?
Pandemic, nice.
Yes, it already existed before Corona, of course. Let's see. Yes, before we start off, and then René will tell you everything about gamification, we wanted to ask the audience if you already have experience with gamification in your work. Maybe a small example from my side. We're now having this health challenge and we're tracking our steps every day with the team. And then we have also the competition part, which team will be the winner. So don't know if you have any example you want to talk about, René, while we wait for the answers.
In our own work, you mean?
Yes.
You know, it is my work, of course, studying it. I haven't seen many examples of gamification in the university, although I have seen, for instance, one of the ongoing problems for students is getting students to fill in evaluation forms for courses. So they now added like percentages. So you filled in so many percentages of your course evaluations, and that apparently, the goal is that triggers more students to actually fill it in. I'm not sure about that, but you can see little like examples of that going on.
Would you also classify that as gamification, or would you more say that that's more related to one of the psychological phenomena, how we try and trick the brain and motivate people?
Well, interestingly enough, these tricks, these like forms of nudging or these forms of extrinsic motivation are, of course, way older than gamification is, as is the research on it. So gamification is a new word or a new form of bringing it about, but the underlying assumptions and the underlying thinking and the underlying strategies have been around for a long time, of course. I always use the Boy Scouts, scouting for the Dutch, as an example, where you have these badges, right? The badges are usually a great example of gamification, but if you join the Boy Scouts and you do something beneficial to the society, you get these badges. So like an early example of gamification there as well.
That's a very nice example. I think most people can relate to that. I see also that people filled in ommetje. I am familiar with that one. Also how you can make sure that you try and be healthy, but also the competition part. Do you have anything to say about competition, how important or not important that is for gamification?
Well, that's already an interesting discussion point, of course. Some gamified application offer forms of competition among, for instance, colleagues or students or wherever you implement such a system. But it's not always the actual goal of those, making the ordering that gamified application that it actually triggers competition. Usually the goal is something else, to, for instance, motivate people to become healthy. But the outcome is some weird form of competition which wasn't there before. So that can also happen. Your competition can be a good thing, but it can also be a result which you didn't expect, or you should have expected.
Yeah, talking about other results, whether they're expected or not. So gamification is used in many different applications. We see here some examples of education or becoming healthier. What do you think of gamification and how it is applied before the modern age, but also in this age with more IT?
I think that maybe we can go to that next slide, because I think that's so gamification. There's basically there's a broad definition of gamification which is very akin to what I called nudification before. When people say there is a gamification of culture or something, it means that games are more and more present in our in our daily media use, for instance. There is a more specific form of gamification which is related to some of the books which was in the previous slides, which is a design strategy aimed at bringing about, for instance, behavioral change, right? So it's a marketable term, and which for at least around 15 years ago is too long ago, let's say 10 years ago, became somewhat of a hype. And that form of gamification can be defined as, and this is coming from an interesting source which actually thought of this broad definition, the use of design elements, characteristics of games, points, badges, scores, in a non-game context. So you take part of what makes games, in this case the quantifiable end results, the points, the scores, and you apply that into something which is not a game. So in the little overview you see there, which is also from that same source, you see that gamification or gameful design is in the top right corner. It is about gaming, but it only uses parts of games, right? There's also forms of gaming which use games as a whole, and then you of course get proper games, or even serious games for simulation or educational games. And then down there you have, toys which are created for play versus gaming. Gaming is more rule-related, rule-based play. And playing in general is like rule-free play, like kids playing around in the park, for instance, without or creating their own rules as they go. That's toys. And if it's not even recognizable as a toy, and it's also not a true game, then you have playful design, which is basically adding play elements to a situation. As soon as you add game elements to such a situation, points, badges, quantifiable mechanics, then you arrive at what a lot of people call gamification, which one of the first steps, of course, 10 years ago when all of this happened, when all these new books were written, were game theorists, game designers trying to define what was going on. And this is one of the first efforts to do that. But your question was something else apart from the definition, I think.
Well, I already heard it a little bit in your explanation, but what do you think of how gamification is applied these days? I can already hear you have a preference for one of the pictures in the diagram.
Not necessarily so, though. I mean, there's good forms of gamification and bad ones, and that's the same for serious games and games, of course, and toys and playful design. What we did see, however, and things which drew a lot of criticism when gamification first became a thing 10 years ago, were the very point-based, badge-based forms of gamified applications, which really try to get you to log in at places like Foursquare, or try to get you to consume something, or try to get you to do something like run more, which some game designers called exploitationware, because they're not proper games, and they're basically a way to nudge you in a direction which you're not necessarily always aware of. And by doing so, try to sell you stuff or gather your data in the process. It drew a lot of criticism. And since I say that, like, from a design perspective and also from a theoretical perspective, gamification has broadened up to include way more than just those early examples of badges and points.
Do you also have some practical examples for our audience? For example, one bad and one good application?
I think one of the next slides, I think, actually has two examples, which some of you might know or might not know. So the one on the right, Untapped. So those who are into beer, drinking beer, especially craft beer, might know this. So this is an app where every time you have a drink, especially when there are unique new drinks you hadn't had before. Let's say some IPA from a local brewery from Groningen or something. You can log it in Untapped, and you get points for your 5th unique IPA beer, or your second time this week that you drank a beer for more than 5% alcohol or something. So you get badges for drinking. It's great. It's great for bars. It's great, especially great for breweries and microbreweries who have received a lot of attention. If you go to the supermarket and you get one like a small brewery, they now have all the Untapped logos on there and a QR code, so you can instantly log the beer. But you can, at the same time, what you also then see are like weird side effects, as when you go into a bar, when I go into a bar, because I'm an avid user of Untapped, when I go into a bar, I don't order what I necessarily want, but I order what I haven't had before, right? I ordered the weird thing from the menu. You could think all kinds of things about that. Is that good or is that bad? But at least it changes the way you consume. It changes so that I now no longer sit down in a bar and have a beer. I now sit down and have that specific beer, because that specific beer means a point in a system which no one cares about except for me. And the reason that I care is that other people in Untapped might see my profile, my friends might see my profile and might see that I have one more than, right? So it becomes this weird game you unconsciously start to play. And in terms of environmental issues, of course, you could also say like the success of microbreweries due to systems like Untapped also leads to more bottles which are not being recycled, because only the larger brands have these statiegeld and smaller breweries do not. But then again, it's good for those microbreweries because without them, they wouldn't exist and so on. But this is an example which is like a good and bad example of Untapped. And the other one is the Samen Gezond app, which is a health-based app from one of the Dutch zorgverzekeraars.
Insurance companies.
Big insurance companies. And this game, one of my students did a really interesting thesis on this app, where we critically looked at this app and how this quantified your health. So you get a fit score, and suddenly you're not healthy, but you're healthy, let's say 18, right? And you do stuff and you type it in, and suddenly something changes, and you're now healthy 19. And that score is also linked to commercial partners of that health insurer. So if you use products of that particular health insurer, like if you have glasses your score goes up and down. So here's another system which works like this weird, system where you start to change the way you look at your daily life, look at your health, and you start to quantify it, and you start to make changes based on these scores, even though you're not necessarily know what the score is based on. So apps like these are also both interesting and good because they lead to behavioral change, better health, for instance. But at the same time, do we really want to have commercial organizations have such a large influence on the way you behave through these apps?
Maybe I can. We have a remark from Jasper. He said, "Funny that you mention Untapped. I use it myself, and the token system is something that has no value to me. So for him, it's not about the points. But maybe to add a question to that, does Untapped cares that some of the customers are drinking beers for the points instead of the intrinsic taste of the beer itself? Does Untapped care, or is it just convenient for them? Or?
You mean whether or not Untapped cares about that?
Yeah.
I think that their whole business model is that you use this system, and that, so they care, of course. Well, they will probably also have, of course, health information on the website stating that you shouldn't drink too much, which of course is true. There's nothing in the system which forces you to drink more. That's what you do. Yeah. However, it could be triggered by a system like this.
Maybe I can phrase it a little bit differently. If you take Tinder, for example, there are remarks that the gamification of the app changes is not in line with the goals of their users. So the app wants you to come back to date again, but the user is using the app to never use it again. So there's a conflict in the gamification and the goal of the user.
Yeah. So it makes dating easier and more convenient, and but at the same time, it changes the way you. Well, Tinder is a good, these dating apps are good examples because they slowly but surely have the potential, at least, to change the way you think about relationships and to how you think about dating, right? And that is not based on. We now live in a society where we simply have those apps, so that's what happens. No, it happens because these systems are designed in that way. And these are usually also commercial systems, so they are deliberately designed in certain ways to slowly but surely nudge you into certain directions. But never to such a degree, of course, that they destroy their own user base, but it does happen. I mean, it's like Facebook never started out to become this huge, massive information database which changes politics and whatnot. But it did.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to tell you this remark from Jasper and keep them coming.
It's a good point. It's the same as Foursquare. Some people, when Foursquare was like a predecessor of Untap, some people just use it to show friends where they were. Others started to move differently through the city in order to log in everywhere to become mayors of places they cared not about, but just to become mayor there. That was one of the goals of that particular system. So it's really like dependent on the individual user, of course.
Check. Okay.
Okay. Then one more question, a different topic that we also talked about, René. You mentioned that you're passionate about the game Hearthstone. It was quite popular among my peers in 2014, 2015. So that was already quite some time ago. You also mentioned that this can be associated with metagaming. Can you tell some more about that and how this relates to Hearthstone?
Well, actually, we did talk about Hearthstone. I haven't played it for quite some time because of the metagame, actually. So this is basically just a digital card game, a free-to-play card game at that, made by Blizzard and based on one of their large IPs. And the metagame is basically the card game in itself is relatively simple, but there are so many different cards that the combinations of cards forces players to form strategies. And knowing these strategies and being able to understand that if a player plays that card, you have to respond with that card because he will probably after this card play that card. That's the metagame, and the metagame constantly changes because new cards are being introduced all the time, which means you need to keep playing and earning new cards because that's part of the business model. And in the case of Hearthstone, if you're out, it's pretty difficult to, at least if you play it somewhat competitively, to get back into the game without a proper injection of time. So I haven't played it for quite some while, but the fact that the game is linked to World of Warcraft, one of the big games by this particular company, and a game which I also still occasionally play. A new patch came out today for the people in the audience who care about this stuff. I now turn back to World of Warcraft again a bit.
Nice.
But the metagame is basically the game you play on top of the game, and where a lot of the magic of these games happens.
And so I would say this is quite an interesting strategy because usually I would say companies want to make it as easy as possible. They want to get you hooked. But now this game, either it forces you to become really competitive, and once you're out, the hurdle is that much bigger to get back into it. What do you think of that? Is it a good strategy, or is it good because it is so different?
Yeah, so there's all kinds of ways, of course, to mitigate that problem by, if you come back to the game, that you get some like new free cards, or it's so like getting back into the game takes some effort, but it's doable. If it would be that difficult, the game would cease to be successful, of course. There is always a balance there between keeping it competitive and keeping the metagame active, and ensuring that you don't lose potentially returning players. World of Warcraft is now almost 15 years old, and you can still arguably start that game without too much trouble. But the reason for that is because they kept changing and redesigning not just the end game, where you wind up if you play for a long time, but also everything which came before. So you don't have to play through 15 years of content to reach the point where all the other players are.
Yeah.
And that also means that these companies, Adam will probably explain lots and lots about this. This is very costly. It's not like back in the days, you create a game, you sell it in the marketplace like Super Mario, and then that's it, right? These games are never done. They are constant process of negotiation between developers and different player groups about what the game is, what it should be, where it should be heading. And that's costly because it requires constant development, new content every once in a while, and the revenue models are linked to that.
Yes. Thank you so much, René. Then I want to ask Thijs if you can go to the last Mentimeter question for this talk at least, because time is running out for the first talk, unfortunately, because I found it very interesting. Maybe the audience can share with us what your main takeaway is from this talk. I think it would be very interesting to see what you thought about the topics we talked about, also the ethical dilemmas that René mentioned. Yeah, gaming is everywhere. That's definitely true. Do you also agree, René?
There's this famous book from a Dutch historian, Johan Huizinga, who basically says that we are homo ludens, we are playful beings, and that play and games is foundational for the way we understand each other, understand society. So play has always been with us. It's the foundation of our culture. It's the foundation of society. But what we see way more now, of course, is playful media technology, and that is gaming. Like gaming, this notion of gaming that has bloomed in the past 4 or 5 decades. And yes, gaming is indeed money.
Everything is money in the end. Apps change your choices. Also very interesting. I hope you won't let yourself get influenced too much, people in the audience. Yeah, metagaming, constant development. How the gaming world has changed. There's a beer app.
There's also, I think, a wine app, if you're more into that. There's probably an app for everything.
Very nice. I'll have to check out that wine app. I want to thank you.
We could talk an entire evening about board games too. I'm not sure who typed that in. And that has also seen a massive boost in the past 10 years, and especially now during the COVID situation.
Very nice. I think we have the theme for one of our next editions, board games. I want to thank you, René, very much from the talk. It was very interesting. And thank you for your time for being here.
No problem. I'll stick around for a bit.
Thank you. Now we are going from play and gamification to somebody who is really deeply into the world of game design. Carlijn will be interviewing Adam. The floor is yours.
Thank you. You say it like it's some kind of bad thing, Thijs. He's really deep in the underground of gaming. But he's not. Adam is a user experience researcher for games, right, Adam?
That's right, Carlijn.
Do I say that correctly? Okay. Well, let's just start at the beginning. Like, introduce yourself. Where did your story start?
Sure, and I just want to say goedenavond allemaal, good evening everyone, and Carlijn, Thijs, everyone at Psych-IT, just thank you very much for having me, and thanks everyone for attending. I will answer your question of how it all started, but René said something that just triggered in my mind, and I thought it was very prescient with regards to the comment of homo ludens at the end of his presentation, and I couldn't help but kind of Google something that I remembered. So I just wanted to share that with the group, and then I'll be very happy to say a little bit more about my background and all that. So yes, Thijs mentioned this idea of us all being playful beings. One of my favorite game designers is a man named Hideo Kojima, and he was ousted from a company that he had worked for maybe 15 years, where he had pioneered whole new genres of games. He's like a Pablo Picasso of video games. You can think of them like that. And he was without a job, and he basically created his own studio, and he created a mission statement around this around it. And he wrote something that I thought was very poetic and beautiful. And one piece of it at the end of his mission statement said, and now I'm reading what he said. He said, "Even if the earth were stripped of life and reduced to a barren wasteland, our imagination and desire to create would persevere beyond survival. It would provide hope that flowers may one day bloom again. Through the invention of play, our new evolution awaits." And it's that sense of optimism around play in our playful nature as beings. René recalled that for me, and that's probably very much at the heart of maybe my story, which was your question. So yes, I'm currently an employee at Blizzard Entertainment. I should mention that though I am an employee there, all the things I'm going to be sharing with you are completely my personal opinions, don't reflect Blizzard at all. This is really just going to be about my view on things. My background is in psychology, so I'm from New York originally. I studied psychology, and at the time I was playing video games plenty, but had no notion that this hobby of mine would ever have anything to do with where I was going to be going at all in life. And through studying psychology, I discovered I wanted to be a researcher. And lo and behold, after finishing my master's in Amsterdam, I found that there was an opportunity to do a PhD about the benefits of video games for social and emotional development. And it was one of those crazy moments in life where you're just in the right place at the right time. And it just felt perfect for me. I just looked at myself in the mirror, essentially, and I was like, well, I've been developing my research skills for the last almost decade. I've grown up playing video games my whole life. I think I'm fairly socially competent and healthy. Like this makes sense. Video games has integrated itself in my life in a meaningful way that I feel ready to go and do this. So I did a PhD for about 4.5 years in Nijmegen. And then I spent about a year working in Geneva, Switzerland, where I did a little bit of game design in the board game space to the point of what some people brought up, and also into the serious game space, which René mentioned as well. And then I decided that I wanted to do research in a more applicable way. So within the video game industry, there are positions like what I hold now called user research, where they embed people with skill sets like mine of being able to ask and answer questions in meaningful ways for designers to help the designers understand while they're building the game what the experience is like for the players and why it does not match with the experience that the designer is intending. And my job is to basically consolidate feedback in a way from players that's meaningful enough that the designers are able to make changes to the game so that they can make the experiences that they're designing for happen for as many players as possible.
Well, thank you. That sounds interesting. We're going to talk about that later on. But first, you talked about your postdoctoral study in Geneva. I know you know the answer, so please wait for me to ask the audience. We have a question for you, audience, in Mentimeter. We know a lot about the disadvantages of gaming, like addiction. We just heard about it, and having a tendency to be more violent. You hear that in the news, but do you know anything about the positive effects of gaming? And then after that, maybe Adam can tell us if you were right. Faster reaction speed. Well, only women can multitask, they say, and most gamers are men, right? Or am I wrong?
On the topic of gender, it's difficult because video gaming is such a big umbrella term. So it would kind of be like saying most book readers are women or men.
Well, that's true.
So when you go into different genres of video games, there can be more pronounced gender differences. But broadly speaking, about the same number of women play video games as men. The extent to which like how that distributes in terms of hours played per week, whether like the more hardcore gamer people in terms of time investment is more men than women. I don't think there's been all that much work on that. But even within game genre, for example, of course, individual games can attract different audiences. So broadly speaking, gaming isn't particularly more popular among men. But I'm seeing a lot of really great responses here. So I see a lot of things that have to do with what I would call cognitive advantages. Those are the things like the multitasking, reaction speed, memory training. And then I'm seeing some things that have to do with social skills, like social connections. And then I'm seeing another cognitive one would be kind of problem solving skills, but we might also even think of that in terms of I guess, like creativity. So everyone's like, well, none of these responses are completely out of the box, but maybe I can try to contextualize the science on some of these things for the group here. So
yeah, it would be great.
So when and I love all these responses. So when I started, this PhD that I did probably about a decade ago. At the time, the sort of the narrative around video games was predominantly around the negative effects of video games. They make you addicted. They cause aggression and violence. The aggression and violence thing, by the way, probably won't get into it today, but the findings there are not the strongest. But that was the narrative, right? That was sort of like the global negative assumptions around video games. And our goal was to try to say, well, all that work is super important, right? If there's this thing out there in the world that all these people are hyper engaged in, which we know is the case, and it's doing some bad things, then obviously we should know that, and that's very important as scientists. But there was virtually no discussion at the time about the benefits of video games. It was very, very small. So the first thing that we did was we surveyed the field of research, and very much similar to what René was saying, we incorporated the notion of play and games having been so integral to our human evolution and our human psychology for so long, and using the research that had been done on play and games to kind of shed a light on why it is that we would expect video games, as just sort of another modern iteration of that, to have benefits. So our first paper was like a summary of the current state of the field, as well as almost like kind of like a manifesto of like, these are the things that we know from play and games that we think should encourage us to want to do more of this research. At the time, and I think it's still the case till today, the most well-founded area of research about the benefits of video games were around those cognitive benefits. So for all the people that posted things about multitasking and memory and recall and faster reaction times and things of that nature, that's a very, very well-established domain of research. And that's partly because measuring those things is actually quite straightforward, right? You can think of a task that really puts numbers down to how good somebody is at multitasking on that very specific task, for example. And so that area of research is very well founded. There's a lot of cognitive benefits of video games. At the time, however, the social benefits were far, far, far less looked into. And that's a lot of what our work was all about, and particularly looking at it in children. So for the comments that have to do with all those social skills, the work there in the scientific field is still, even about 10 years later, still not like super duper rich, but there is a broader appreciation, especially as video games themselves have become increasingly social, that video games as a context for social development and social interaction is definitely a place where people can grow in healthy ways.
Well, thank you. Well, that was something I just read in the answers, was some people were saying you get more empathy while playing video games, and that surprised me, actually. Can you tell more about that?
Sure. I'd say there's probably two ways of thinking about it. One is the first one is like I said, games have become increasingly social. So if you were to look at the top 10 grossing video games right now or in the last several years, those lists will be dominated by games that have social interaction embedded into their game features. So that means a game like World of Warcraft, for example, that René mentioned, where it's a space for people to come and interact. And it's also a game that the manner of socializing is integral to succeeding in the game. Fortnite has become a huge, wild success. And it's shown itself to be a place that is a social meeting ground, especially for younger people today. So with regards to empathy, it shouldn't be that odd to think that social spaces that require cooperation in particular are going to help people become more empathetic with other people because they're interacting with other people. That you might be lacking the face-to-face, which is an important channel of communication for receiving empathy, certainly. But it shouldn't be all that surprising that cooperating with people and also seeing a diversity of people in terms of the way people express themselves in games themselves, that would help people become more empathetic. But I would argue that another way in which video games might be able to be doing that is through very, very, very well told, well crafted narratives. So if you think about, one of the most moving books or movies that you've ever seen, and you think about those characters, and you think about how when those characters went through the ups and downs of that story, you felt that as well. There are some very powerful video games that really are able to pull that off as well. Somebody mentioned as one of their favorite games, Red Dead Redemption 2. So the narrative in that game and the characters in that game are so well fleshed out, akin to, like I said, like an incredible book or film, that that might be another channel that people might be able to experience empathy by understanding other people's perspectives.
So you feel for them, right? Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Thijs. What are you doing here?
Well, we have a couple of questions.
Oh.
If I may break in.
Yeah, that's okay.
We have Ding Ding. She asked, what would need to happen for more social research that results in more solid findings?
Yeah, great question, Ding Ding. So science is super slow. René might also be able to speak to that. So, replication, especially in the field of social science, is like the big hot topic. When we were working, one of the major things that we pointed out was the need for more longitudinal work, which it just by its name, right? It sounds like it takes time. So these are studies where people are followed over a period of time, and where you're trying to understand how gaming is part of their life and how their life develops and changes over time. So those are studies that require just a lot of resources, and those are really the gold standard in being able to pull things off. So we need more of those. The other way of doing them is with hard experiments, where you get people to sign up for a group that's a gaming group or a non-gaming group, or maybe even like a mid-tier, like gaming, part-time gaming group. So those are the other types of studies, and I would say just kind of more of those need to happen. Though again, there is more of a consciousness around these benefits, and so there is more and more work like this being done.
Okay, this goes back to the beginning of your talk. What was the most interesting or maybe surprising advantage you found during your research?
Yeah, I could talk about one thing that I wasn't able to find, but that I'm very passionate about. The reason I don't think we found it is because I don't think we ever quite figured out a good way of really assessing it. And then I'll answer it. So sorry if I'm going around the question. So one of the things I'm was super passionate about as a researcher in academia was the notion of perseverance. I really very much like the idea of the games have kind of like a contract with their players, video games in particular. The contract goes something like this: I'm going to build this thing. It's going to be challenging and interesting, but I promise you can beat it. Like, I would not make this product if you couldn't win. And I'm going to make sure that you have the tools to be able to succeed. So built into the experience of a good video game is failure. And so one of the things that I was really passionate about learning about was, do people who play video games, are they more perseverant in ways in their life? So do they try to push through that boundary, and are they willing to fail multiple times and keep trying and coming back again? So that was something I was super passionate about. There's been a little bit of work in the area. And again, my little forays into it, I don't think we ever really quite cracked the code on how to do that. One of the things that I really enjoyed that we found was we did like I said, longitudinal studies are super important. So we did a study where we were on a yearly basis spending time for about an hour and a half with children all across the Netherlands. And each year we were tracking what their gaming lifestyle was like in a given week, and we were finding out from their parents that like how they were developing socially, and we were finding out from them what games exactly they were playing. And there was a big notion around the idea of competitive video games being bad, because cooperative video games might breed empathy, like you were saying, and cooperation and sharing and thinking together, but competitive video games, well, that's where aggression comes out. That's when people get really angry and mad and upset at each other. And we thought that there just wasn't enough nuance to that work. So one of the things that we were able to demonstrate was for the children who were playing competitive video games, when they were playing that with their friends, they were also that their parents were also reporting that these kids were improving at a better rate, in essence, the way in which that their social relationships were. So these kids who were engaging in the competitive gaming context with friends that was helping them breed healthier relationships. And I think if we think about things like sports or anything like that, it makes a lot of sense, because there's a lot of emotions that you have to regulate when you're playing with your friends. You can't be a sore winner or a sore loser. And you have to deal with the fact that when you lose or when you win. And there's also the sense that if this is your friend, this isn't the end. This last game isn't the end. There's a long timeline of you collaborating together on this shared gaming experience, and I think those are all good things.
Yeah, you just said it, sports. So if my kid, well, has a handicap and can't play sports, I could just let it go and game for a little.
Yeah, I think like the number one thing for parents to think about is like anything, what exactly is happening in this context, right? Like I would say it's important for children to socialize and go to parties, but some parties they shouldn't be, right? Some parties don't have like the best type of environment compared to others. So absolutely, like gaming is a great context for people to be able to connect with each other. Certainly in this last year during COVID, where people, were essentially barred and restricted from being able to see each other. There was, a ton of video gaming happening that was bringing people together and making their lives better. So there's a lot of good things to say about doing that.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so let's switch to your work that you do now. You told that you can't tell a whole lot about it, but can you just tell us what a normal workday looks like for you?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, as a user researcher, like I said earlier on in the call, my job is to consolidate feedback from our players in a way that's going to be meaningful for our designers. So we conduct studies that are as close to the high scientific standard that I used to as possible, but within an industry context, we're moving super fast. So any given day, I will typically be in one state or another of conducting a study. So a study's life cycle typically looks like, one, understanding the problem, which is what is it that the designers are trying to create? And what are the aspects of the design that are giving rise to that? And what are their concerns about things being clear or unclear, fun or not fun, being used in the quote unquote right way as intended? That's like the first phase. And then from there, once we understand what those questions are, we formalize them into how are we going to dig deep into this? Is it going to be a survey? Is it going to be an interview? Is it going to be a group discussion? Is it going to be just by watching people play? Is it going to be by watching them play and talking out loud? We put a methodology to answering those questions. We bring in the right people to be able to do that. I sit then with these players as they go through that protocol, whatever that protocol is. And then afterwards, I take all that data and I analyze it. And after it's all analyzed, I report that back to my people, and then we have a discussion around that. And then ideally, they're then able to share with me what their thoughts are on the next change of things. And, eventually down the line, likely that same content will probably get tested again in some form or another. So my day looks very different depending where I am in that process, but I hope to have given people a bit of context on what that looks like.
Yeah, thank you.
We have another question. Yeah. First, a shout out from Josh Lobel. He's very proud of you.
Let's see.
And Raghav Mohan is interested to hear your views about mobile gaming and its microtransaction system from a UX perspective?
Sure. I mean, video games are a very fast-moving, a lot going on, obviously, in the video game space, and there are a lot of things that are continuing to evolve. I think that what Ragav is asking around the idea that now video games within themselves, there's essentially like a marketplace for being able to purchase things. And there's a lot of games that when you get them on your phone, they say that they're free. But then when you get inside, you realize that this content is locked behind having to pay or having to wait or doing all these sorts of things. The video game industry is in a really interesting place. Like it's negotiating it live, like with the public about what are the best ways of monetizing games. And I've been fortunate that the people that I've worked with that design the user experience around any purchasables within the game context, I've been fortunate that their mindset has been very player centric, as opposed to maybe wallet centric for the company. So it really depends on what the design goals are. Like if the design goal is to have a fair, fun way to help people be able to contribute to the game in a way that makes sense, and the UX designers want to design like a smooth process for that, then great. But there are all sorts of practices that are a little bit more shady that people do, where they basically things that we've seen in all sorts of industries. For example, like forcing you to buy credit. And then when you go to buy something in the store, your credit is always just a little bit under or just a little bit over. And then you have to buy a little bit more credit to get it. Or you spend your credit and then you have a little bit left and you feel like you wasted. So then you buy more, like things like that is like that still kind of exists in the microtransaction space. And different companies are navigating that. And designers are all, certainly embroiled in trying to figure out the best way of doing that.
Okay, thank you. Just one last question because we're almost out of time. René just talked about games being never done. What about you? Do you think games are ever done, or when's the time that you stop working on a game and go to another version or another game?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things René was referring to is how many games today that are released, they don't just live as a product off of the shelf that you play and then you finish. They live on as a social space for players to keep interacting with each other, and also for a space for the content creators to keep adding content, whether that's free or paid or whatever it is. And I've now worked on games in both formats. When I was working in Montreal, I worked on the Far Cry series, and those games are very much basically box products. And at Blizzard, I was working on Hearthstone, and the environment is very different. Like when it was a product that we were going to ship on the store shelves, we were running a study about every 3 weeks on like the game as a whole. Like, how is it all coming along? If somebody plays through the entirety of this game in whatever many hours it takes for them to complete it, what are the peaks and valleys of that experience? What are the systems that are working and aren't working? And based on the study, then they'd make changes, and then lo and behold, there'd be another study again. When you're working on a live product, we're helping them ship content that comes out, but the content is like smaller than the size of a full game. So the number of iterations we get on it is actually tends to be much less. And there's also, of course, a focus on understanding the people that are playing your game right now. So to kind of close the loop, because René did mention Hearthstone, one of the things he pointed out was it was very difficult for him as a player to have spent some time away from Hearthstone and then to come back, and he might think that he understands the way that the cards work for strategy, but actually because there's a metagame around Hearthstone and there's a way in which all these different people are playing the game, and you've now missed out as a player on what are these predominant strategies. It was very difficult for him as a player to kind of get into it. And that's the type that dovetails some of the work that we were able to do. We were able to try to support the team in coming up with clever ways of helping players like René come back into the game. Because Hearthstone is kind of an example of a game that's constantly updating and constantly allowing people to interact with each other and keep providing new content for players, that's going to keep it spicy and interesting.
Well, thank you. I'm sure René's glad to hear that you try to help him. Okay, well, I think our time is up, but Thijs, are there any questions left?
I think Nicolas Berbese said, I think this is more like a remark, regarding the psychology of play in Hearthstone, can we talk about the pity timer? I'm not a Hearthstone player, so I don't know how to...
Sure, I think what he's referring to is when you're buying, the way that Hearthstone works is that you want to have a diverse amount of cards that interact with each other in a meaningful way so that you can have an interesting strategy when you're playing against somebody else who has cards that combine in an interesting way for a different strategy. And the way that you build out your collection of cards is you buy a pack. And when you buy a pack, you get 5 cards, and the cards have different levels of rarity. Relatively speaking, the more rare the card, kind of the more powerful it might be, or the more useful it is for the strategies that you'll be able to build. And the most powerful cards tend to be legendary cards, which are also the most rare. So the pity timer refers to the fact that when a player buys a large number of packs, there's a guarantee that within the first, I believe it's 8 or 9 packs, you can look it up online, this is all public knowledge, there's a guarantee that you will get at least 1 legendary. So that way you feel that with your purchase of X amount, like you're guaranteed to get at least some kind of value out of it.
Well, now I'm curious if Nikolai finds this a good thing or a bad thing, the pity timer, because it sounds good to me. Or not?
I mean, it's something to help our players. I'm not sure if it's something that's been around for all of Hearthstone's life cycle or was added later. I would guess it was added a bit later, though I'm not 100% certain because,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, Nikolai, please let us know. Maybe we can come back to it. So,
Okay.
No further questions.
Okay, well then, Adam, thank you for your time.
Well, thank you
Very
again for
interesting.
having
Very
me.
much.
Yep,
Thank
I
you.
really enjoyed it, and it was great to hear René speak as well. I'll stick around a little bit longer, so if there's any other thoughts or comments, I'll be here for a little bit.
Cool.
Thank you.
Okay, and then we go from recreational use, I could say, I think, with René analyzing the ludification of culture, and Adam trying to enhance and better the experience of the recreational user. We are going to the professional scene with Juicy and Francois.
Oh yeah, thank you, Thijs. Before we going to introduce Juicy, he's of course in coach in esports. We have a question for you by in Mentimeter, I think. Do you consider esports as a real sport? And I'm very curious about it. And I think Juicy also.
Yeah, I mean, you probably can guess where I'm heading towards, but I think it's a really interesting question because of the notion of what a sport is. But we'll get to that in a bit. In the meantime, I'll just introduce myself. I'm UC Mormon, but I mostly just go by Juicy because that's my gamer tag. And basically, everyone who is full-time into the gamer scene is just they refer to each other by their gamer tags, so that's what I go by. But I'm 24 years old, and since about a year or so I'm just full-time into esports. I started out as a caster, so basically giving commentary over other people playing games, and I've slowly made the transition to being a coach for the game that is known as Rocket League. Some of you may have known it or may have heard about it, others maybe not, but we'll get into that as well. I'm interested to see that. It's pretty much even though.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about those people that answer no?
What I think, and I'll pull up my my presentation as well, because before you can actually say whether it is an actual sport, you gotta realize what esports actually entails, because for a lot of people they have this idea that gaming and esports is one and the same, when in essence it really isn't. Gaming is where you just play a certain game because you enjoy it, whereas in esports there's the competitive side of things. I mean, if you had football without the big stadiums where it's just kicking a ball about on the street for like an hour each week, people wouldn't consider it a sport either. And I think that's where a big difference lies. So you gotta step away from gaming being the entire thing. So if you get into the professional side of things, and then today I really want to focus on the multiplayer games as well, because there's also the speedrunning scene, which is playing a single player game as quick as you can and just trying to get a world record, but it's not actively against each other, right? It's basically as if you would run 100 meters, but then nobody would ever race each other. They'll just try to do it the fastest. And it lacks some of the entertainment that the real sport does. So in that sense, I think that esports is a sport. And to the people that say that it doesn't really have the physical side of things, I mean, do you consider stuff like curling a real sport then? Because it's not as physically demanding as football, for example, but it still requires some physical aspects. And I think esports are the exact same.
Is it what you say about playing football without stadiums or public? Gaming is, it can be extremely addictive, and sometimes there's also addiction care for it, I think. But those top elites, like now it's the European Championship football, like Kylian Mbappé, Frenkie de Jong, Ronaldo.
You're really naming the ones that aren't playing anymore.
No, but those are the most famous.
Yeah.
They practice the sport very intensively,
Right.
but it's not seen as an addiction.
Right.
And how
exactly.
do you look at that? Because when you play games, and especially in esports, it can be very addictive.
Yeah, exactly. It 100% is, because the interesting thing, and Adam talked about this a lot as well, is that, and René as well, the meta game, right? So basically the entire thing is, as a pro athlete, as a pro gamer, you have to keep playing the game in order to stay at top, which means for the players that I currently coach, most of them are putting over 50 hours a week into the game to try and make sure that they stay at the exact same level, or even keep improving. And I think the difficulty lies in when it is actually harmful to do so, because these guys get paid a salary in order to do what they do. If you were to look at Ronaldo, like you said, and check if that's an addiction, people probably wouldn't see it as such, even though he puts in a lot of hours, just because he's able to, feed his family because of it. And I think that's where a big hurdle is for esports, because they're still young children too. At times, I mean, some of these esporters are 15 years old, so they don't really realize what the next step is after esports, after their gaming career is over, like what is next. And especially if you don't make it to the complete top, which is the same for, a footballer, for a musician, you can really enjoy it. But if you don't get to that absolute top, that's when it becomes dangerous, because you might want to make it into a career, but you're not quite good enough to do so. That is when it becomes dangerous. And I think gaming is no different than a football, than a musician, and that kind of stuff.
And like you said, you have youngsters who play at 15 years old, maybe younger.
Yeah.
And it's also with top athletes. They start at a young age, but they are finished around, Ronaldo is one of those outsiders, but around 30, 35, they will stop playing, practicing their sport on a high level. How is it with those with the ages in esports for now?
Right. So what I see is that most of the really high level talent is up until 24 years old, and most of them start competing at like age 15, but they've been playing the game for years on out by that point. For Rocket League especially, where I coach and play as well, there was one guy called Scrub Killer, very fitting name. When he was the minimum age of being able to compete at the absolute highest level is 15, but he already was well known throughout the scene when he was 12. So it's basically like 3 years of waiting until he was old enough to actually compete, and then he got this massive offers from organizations to play under their name. But after you're like 24, you can see that, or at least it is thought that some of the capabilities from the players, like the hand-eye coordination, reaction sheets, slowly are starting to decline. You're not learning the new stuff in the game maybe as quick as the youngsters are, because some of the games are very mechanical, just purely based on hand-eye coordination. And they just can't keep up. So after 24, the question is, what do you do? Because if you haven't done it next to your school, if you haven't dipped into content creation, if you haven't set up a coaching career possibly in the future, then you're 24 years old. Yes, you've had a stable income and stuff in the past, but now what? And I think that's where a big fear for a lot of parents, for example, also lies.
Yeah, and are those youngsters, for example, the guy from 12 years old, is he allowed to be on big events? Like in my younger years, I was practicing Aikido, this kind of martial art, but I had to be 16 before I could do my black belt exam.
Yeah, so it's sitting on the sidelines. You can play the game, you can play it in its ranked environment, but the actual competitions, the big tournaments for the big prize money, you cannot play. So that's big sad. To quickly come back though as well on the esports versus sports thing, because I think one thing that's really interesting to me at least is that in the past few years there's been a lot of sport instances that are taking esports more seriously. So especially in 2007, it was the first time that the Asian Indoor Games, which is a sporting event in Asia, they started having medals for certain esports genres. So certain games were picked out, and there were competitions for actual medals. And that is a trend that has just been continuing throughout the years. In 2017, the International Olympic Committee hosted an event in coordination with Intel, which is a big computer manufacturer, in order to have some events in different games rightly before the Olympics. And that is something that keeps continuing. Same goes for Tokyo. There was a big event planned, which I was supposed to compete at right before the Tokyo Olympics. And as well as small stuff like in 2017, a Dutch student at the Amsterdam Medical University got granted top sport status. I'm not quite sure if that's the same name in English, but basically he was granted to slow down his studies a little bit in order to pursue gaming and his top career, because he was like third in the world at the time, which are developments that suggest that are kind of in line with regular sports and can get esports to the next level as well.
Yep. You are a coach in esports. How
Yes.
did you? How did you came? How did you think about it? Why did you choose for coaching in esports?
So for me, I absolutely fell in love with Rocket League, and I think that's the story for a lot of players where it starts. You get a game and you enjoy it and you sink way too many hours into it. And for me, I found this community which was really centered around talking about the game, improving each other, and just making philosophies of how the game should be played around like the meta game, which is a recurring theme throughout tonight. But that's where I really started to get interested. Then I went on to have a bit of a casting career, which is something that I still do, so commentary. And some of the players that I commentated over were like, hey, you kind of know a lot about the game. Would you consider coaching? And that's kind of where it started for me. I worked with some guys who at the time were like the top 20 teams of Europe. And then from there on out, in this November, I signed with the Wolverhampton Wanderers, which is a football club in the UK. They have their esports department, basically. They wanted the Rocket League team, and then they just started DMing players and coaches and got into touch with me. Everything kind of started rolling, and I started coaching for them and for their team. And
what did your loved ones think about your choice? Because it's kind of scary, because it's something, quite new. To be a coach in esports. So what did they think about it?
Yeah, so I started last September, which is basically when the academic year started. I just finished around the second to third year of my computer sciences study, and I wasn't not enjoying it. It was all right, but it wasn't really where my heart was at. And then I kind of talked with my parents, and I told them, hey, this is going on right now. I'm starting to get little jobs here and there, just starting to make some money. It wasn't big money. It wasn't paying the bills money, but it was something, and something that I absolutely loved to pursue. And they recognized that. And I've been very fortunate with how supportive my parents at least have been with the entire career. But it's also the other side of it. I've had a relationship just die out because of esports, because it's very demanding. You know, the guys are putting in 50 hours a week, but so am I. We're spending every single evening 3 to 4 hours just putting in the practices together, looking at so basically, just to give a big background information there as well, what I do is I do two things. The first one is managing the esports team, so making sure that the guys are aware of their schedules, scheduling training times, scheduling practice matches, that kind of stuff. So very timing sort of things, planning sort of things. And then the other side is the actual coaching, which is basically in two parts. First of all, it's when we're not on game day, it is looking through old replays, old matches that we played, and seeing if I can find mistakes from one particular player or from the team as a whole, where I feel like we can improve on. And on the other side, there's the live coaching, which is during game day. So I'm basically, the guys are playing, I'm in their ears, and then whenever something happened after a game and we need to go into the next one, I'll give them a few pointers. But it's also very psychological. It's very based on how I want them to feel, to make sure that they're in the right mindset, that kind of thing.
Maybe a question that follows, and it's also asked in the chat. What was your best achievement or coaching moment as a coach?
So that was actually not too long ago. We were in the top 16 of Europe, and we had to win one more match to get into the top 8, because it was a elimination bracket, and we played against one of the best teams out there, probably like top 3 in Europe. We were 15 minutes in the series, so Rocket League is played in best of 5s often, where you basically play 5 matches of 5 minutes. We went 15 minutes without scoring a single goal, and then we managed to score one in basically the extra time of the third game in order to tie it up. Then we won that game, and we proceeded to win the series in order to get top 8. That was a very proud achievement, but I hope to get my best one nearing July, as there's a big event, but we'll get to that at the end of the presentation as well.
Okay, maybe regarding achieving the moment in the future, how do you manage the mental health of your team?
Yeah, so that's very interesting, because first and foremost, I have never done any psychological study, that kind of thing. And up until basically this year, there hasn't been a lot of help for esports coaches as a whole either. Starting this year, at least the University of Portsmouth has had their first, I think they called it the Bachelor of Esports Coaching and Performance, which is very focused on sports psychology. And that's basically where they're getting most of their information from. But up until the upcoming year, there hasn't been anything. So what I've learned is that everyone is vastly different. And what I do is very individual focused. And then I'm lucky that Rocket League only has 3 because all the games has 5 and it becomes even more of a mess. But to give an example, I've had one player who, in my mind, is an actual prodigy at the game, and he'll only get better as time goes on. But at one point, he came to me after a practice, and he said that he didn't like that I was so positive because he thought that it made him play a certain way where he was basically being too cocky, which are very small things, but that's how individual it is. Because others, as soon as you mention one negative word, they just switch off and they can't even play the game anymore. So mental health is a really big important thing, especially considering burnouts, because we're currently in off season. We've had a year of basically tournaments every week. So every single weekend, you need to be at your absolute peak to perform. And there's basically no downtime. If you want to have a day off, you need to schedule it, because otherwise there is no day off. And I think that's very demanding on the players. It's also a very big issue from the publishers themselves. But right now, there's not being done enough for the mental health of the players. Now, I'm very fortunate because I was able to sign with Wolves, and they have this fantastic care program. So I'm getting a call like once every few weeks to ask how I'm doing and if everything's all right. But that's only the absolute biggest of organizations, and a lot of the guys that try to compete at the highest level do not have that support.
Check. I don't know, a curious question, I think, for the public. Like those famous, in this case, still, Ronaldo, he earns lots of money. I'm curious about what the people think, what a good, very good esporter earns on tournaments or at salary. So I think we have the question. Yeah. How much has the highest earning esporter earned in their lifetime?
Yeah, very interested to see how everyone will be responding to that one, because first and foremost, it really differs based on the game as well, because some of the games have been around for absolute years, others are sort of new, so it depends on the game as well to see how the highest earning esporter is. But the prize pools for some of the tournaments have absolutely boomed over the last few years. I see that most people are fairly correct right here.
Yeah, it's quite new as well, I think. Those
Yes.
esport tournaments.
Yeah,
So-
and especially like the really big prize pools are fairly new. So so still the answers coming in, but I'll give some numbers just to give a reference. So Rocket League, the thing that I'm coaching in, had a $4.5 million prize pool over the past year. But that is divided over several different continents as well. So it's a part of it goes to Oceania, part of it goes to Europe, part of it goes to America, and it's also over the course of a year. Now, the highest earning esporter has almost earned, it's a Dota 2 player, by the way, he has almost earned $7 million over the course of his lifetime. And most of it comes from 2 tournaments, and that's called the Dota Invitational. It is a gigantic tournament, and I think last year's prize, the first team's prize was 30 million alone. Now you do split that among 5, but that's still a pretty decent payout for a tournament.
Is it also possible to as a team to buy other players from other teams as well, just like in football?
Yeah, 100%. And not just the players that are being bought. Very recently, Schalke 04, which is a football club as well, but they have a League of Legends team. Their spot was in like the highest league was bought over by BDS for, I think, 25 million euros. So they're franchising sport. And franchising is something that's very interesting to me as well, because in Rocket League, everything is an open circuit, which means the players just sign up for any tournament. And with most tournaments, you can try and get to the top and actually have a shot at winning. The problem that faces is that the spot subsequently belongs to the players, which means that they have a certain autonomy or like a certain power over the coaches, because if two-thirds of the players want to remain the same, then the coach essentially has no right of speaking. And then for other esports, if you look at League of Legends, everything is franchise, which means that the teams actually belong to the organization, and the organization decides who the players on the rosters are, who the coaches on the rosters are. So the dynamic that you have there is vastly different as well.
Check. Esports is kind of new, actually. It's been for a few years, I think. But where do you see any opportunity for IT to help, professionally, and how do you look at the future of esports?
Yeah, so I think both IT and psychology, like I mentioned before, the mental health thing, currently it's only available for the absolute top organizations, as well as sports psychologists, that kind of stuff. That needs to be basically available to any organization. That needs to be everywhere, because that's how you grow as the entire scene. But that requires a lot of money and also more power to the organizations, which isn't necessarily the best to your competitive environment. But then for IT, I think what's really interesting is that currently there's not being done that much with it, which is strange to me, because with games, an entire game is just data. The entire thing is data, because if I rewatch some of the old games, everything that's being done is essentially ones and zeros, and there's like websites and programs that I can push the replay into, and I get like exactly how much boost everyone has used, where they were on the pitch, that kind of stuff. But then to actually do something with it currently, that is up to me, rather than a data analyst who has done an entire study based on that kind of stuff and can really just learn more from it. Football, for example, as well, they're starting to give footballers these trackers so they can track them throughout the entire match, and then they have a bunch of data analysts who actually look into it, and then I think in tandem with coaches, they try to take that information and bring it to the next level. And I think another thing where esports can really learn is deep learning is one thing where I feel like that's really helpful, because there's OpenAI is something that's been growing steadily over the past years. You've had first they defeated a grandmaster in chess, then someone in Go, and now a few years ago they managed to make an AI which was able to beat Dota 2 players, which is a big difference, because for example during chess, a chess match is around 40 moves, whereas with Dota 2 they had it running on, I think, 2,000 ticks a minute, which means basically like 2,000 ticks a second, I think, which is that's how many calculations they do. But then the match runs for 40 minutes, so they end up doing basically 80,000 different moves, and it was still able to beat the pros, which is something that's really interesting.
Cool. Oh, Thijs.
Yeah, we have a question from Andre. Are you still in contact with players who stopped because of being too old? And if yes, how are they doing and what are they doing?
Yeah, it's vastly different. So a lot of basically the way I see it, there are three venues that most players go into. There's the ones that just go into coaching. And they don't necessarily make the best coaches, because all of their knowledge just comes from playing the game itself, and they lack that social aspect sometimes of also knowing how to say things rather than only knowing what to say. Then there's the really smart people who amass a big following on social media and dip into content creation. So streaming live on Twitch, making YouTube videos, tutorials, that kind of thing. That is an absolutely booming industry that I only will see continue to grow. And that is basically a very, very easy path if you've had your pro following, because that's what you get. You get tons of fans, just like people are fans of Messi and Ronaldo. They are also fans of Simple and Faker and that kind of players. But then the third avenue is just nothing to do with esports. So there's a lot of players that basically tell themselves, hey, I'm doing this now. I finished my school. I've got my basic degree. I'll be doing this for 2-3 years, and then I'll go right back to university, pick something up that I enjoy. One of my players, for example, recently retired. A player that I coached, he retired, and he was like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna become a lawyer now. So he's going to start his law education the upcoming year. So it really differs per person as well.
Yeah, we are almost at the end of this event. So in less than 2 weeks, there is the Intel World Open will be held, and our country is also represented over there.
Mm-hmm.
You, Holland. And what do your next days look like in preparation to that event?
Yeah, so basically on the 13th and 14th of July, we will be playing in the Intel World Open, which is the Olympics thing that was supposed to happen in Tokyo, but is now all happening online. And we'll be facing off against 7 other teams to try and win the European, Middle East and Africa Regional Cup, basically. And up until that point, I will basically be coaching 3 hours a day, at least with the guys, where we go into practice session, we look over our old replays, and up until that point, we'll just be practicing our specific playstyle, but also playstyles that we feel like the opponents will try, and basically figure out what the best way to stop those are. One thing that I am still interested out, because we did have one more question I think that we were going to ask the audience about how they see it from their areas of expertise, basically. That is one question that I would like to see the answers to as well, if we could. Yeah. So then I think especially what's interesting to me is how you could improve as well esports from your line of work, because I genuinely think that there's a lot of ways that we can still grow, because it is such a young industry. And I've taught myself everything by just doing so, and by just being in the moment and teaching myself that way, rather than going to a university class, which is vastly different than most lines of work. Yeah, so a lot of analytics, yeah.
Analytics.
And I think that's a future too. I think there could be so much done with that.
So if you're interested in esports, go.
And I think one thing that's also very interesting to me is thinking about where it will be in a few years, because that's something that came about, I think, in Adam's presentation as well, is where we'll be in a few years. And I think esports won't necessarily be next to mainstream normal sports, but I think really have its own niche. And same with how TV took over radio. I can see the online streaming platforms like Twitch really take over from regular TV as well. And that is something that 5 years ago, I would have said that it was going to take decades, that it was going to take until people my age, my generation, who absolutely grew up with gaming and esports, really got into positions where you can make a change happen. But I'm starting to see it much sooner. I think the later generations are also understanding how important esports is to the culture of our current generation and gaming as well as a whole. I'm really starting to understand that is, in fact, the future, basically.
Yeah, it happens too fast. When I started 14 years ago at my job, we had a business trip to Ohio, and I bought the first real iPhone over there, the first one. And 14 years later, we have the iPhone 12, I think now, and
Yeah.
and when you compare those phones, it's absolutely amazing what happened in 14 years.
I mean, a funny thing, basically, esports started out in America, where you had these street fighting games, in arcades, right? And what you would have is there in one city there'd be a person who was really good, and then someone else would go to another city, and there was someone good there, and he would be like, no, but you're not as good as the other guy from the other city, and they would arrange a meetup, and basically those two people would fight it out, and that's how the esports kind of started. That's how small it was just 20 years ago, and now we're filling entire football stadiums with 60,000 people who want to watch the event live, let alone the millions that are watching at home from behind their television or computer screen.
Yeah, a few weeks ago I met you for the first time, and you were talking about esports, and normally I was just like, oh, esports, but you made me really. It's very enthusiastic when I think about it now. It's kind of cool. But I think we are at the end of this event. Maybe there are any questions, Thijs? Are there any questions left?
We've answered all the questions.
Oh, thank you, Juicy. I want to thank you. I could keep on going because I have lots of questions left, but
yeah, just make sure to watch. The Dutch team will be playing 13th of July at 11 a.m. Netherlands time, CEST. So make sure to put that into your calendar.
Yep. So we can keep our orange merchandise.
Exactly. Since the footballers aren't so great.
Well,
exactly.
I will watch. It's better than football for me.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we have come to an end. Thank you very much, René, Adam, Juicy. It really means a lot to us that you make time, that you make room in your schedules. Thank you all for watching, participating in chat, in the Mentimeter. Together we make this evening. Our next event will be in September. It will be about virtual reality and psychology. We are talking with a startup that is creating VR worlds and VR experiences to battle bullying on the work floor, for example, but also to create more inclusive organizations. So that will be really interesting. If you want to stay updated, you will get an update when we are ready with the event on our meetup site. And with that, I want to thank you again for your time and attention, and have a good evening.